Hello and welcome to Crafting Insanity, the new series I'm going to be trying to do where in each episode I try to implement an interpreter of a different esoteric programming language. The first language we're looking at is a language called CopyPasta, which was made in the 19th of April 2018 by the EsoLang wiki user Bautonia, or something like that. Sorry if I butchered your name. The language only has 4 defined commands, and before we write the interpreter, I'll show you what each one does and go through a few examples. The first command we're going to look at is copy. When the copy command is found, it will look at the next line beneath that instruction and copy whatever is there to the clipboard. After that, we have the copy file command. After the program, the interpreter finds the copy file instruction, it will look for some file name on the line below, and it will copy the contents of that file to the clipboard. If that's not a file name, instead it will just copy the source code of the program that we are interpreting. The duplicate command will duplicate whatever is on the clipboard a given number of times, where the integer amount of times is on the line below the duplicate command. Finally, the last command is pasta, which will print out whatever is copied to the clipboard, and then it will exit the interpreter. First, I started off by making my project, my interpreter, which is called CopyPasta. Here I start writing my header comment, which is a summary of what this program is. Honestly, I probably could have done a better job of writing my header comment. Then I start listing off all of the 4 commands in the language, as well as what they do. This is just so I don't have to look back to the internet as a reference, and I can just look back up to my header comment just if I need to remember what each command does. And of course, I just write down who wrote this program, which is me, and the date. I've technically written this before, but this is more of a revised version, even though I do still have a couple of problems, which you'll see later. I use a module called Clip, which is just for allowing me to paste and copy stuff, and that will be in the description or in the project that you can find. So we're making a function called Tokenize. This will split up the program into each one of the commands, or any value or text that I'll be copying or anything. So what I do is I try to split up the program by lines, so I have each line as a separate element in the list, and there's technically an error here which I'll catch later. It should have been program.split and not tokens.split, but I'll fix that later in the program. Then what I decided to do was add a new line character to each one of the tokens. So each one of the commands or values. I'm pretty sure later I actually remove that because I realized I don't really need it, but that's besides the point. Then I decided to try to make every single token in the program uppercase for some reason. I also changed this because I realized this would make any text that I would print out to the screen in uppercase. I then define a function called CopyPasta, which is just going to be the interpreter. This is a loose definition of interpreter. This isn't actually what a full-fledged interpreter does, but for our purposes, it will work just fine. I make a variable called raw program, which is just going to be the program that we are currently interpreting. This is just in case we are going to copy the source code of this program and not the source code of some other file. I then quickly revise and add on some stuff to some of the descriptions of the commands in my header comment because I realized that it wasn't correct fully. I decided to define a new function called isFile. This basically will return a Boolean true if some given file is, actually exists on the user's computer. So all it does is it tries to see if there's some error from opening the file. If there is an error, it will just return false. And I try to see if there's any sort of error called a file not found error, which is basically Python trying to find a file and it not finding that file at all. Then I say otherwise, if there are no errors, and that means the file does exist, we're going to return true, as in, this file does exist on the computer. I then start adding on to the interpreter some more. I make a variable called I. This is just going to be an index that we'll put into the tokens list so we can get each command. And here we're saying we're going to go through basically every single command in the list of tokens. And we make a variable called tokens, which will get all the tokens from the program that we get by feeding the program into the function Tokenize. And if I really wanted to, I could have put this into a for loop, but if we have it as a variable I, that means we can do some important things that we'll get to later. I make a new function called raiseError. This just takes an error message, which will print out to the screen, and then I'll basically just quit out of the program. This is just so I don't have to write a bunch of code that will quit out of the interpreter 1,000 times over. Because the last time I wrote this, I had a lot of redundant code like that. Alright, I then enter in the while loop that's inside of the CopyPasta function, I make a variable called command. This is just going to be basically the current command that we're looking at, that we're going to execute. And we get that command by using I as an index inside of tokens, which is a list of each command. I then get rid of all white space around our command, and later I will convert the command into uppercase and then get rid of all white space around it. Here I'm just checking the commands once more so I know what the heck I'm doing. But like I mentioned before, since I get rid of making every single command and everything in the program uppercase, I'm going to do that later when I'm checking to see what command it is. Here I'm checking to see if we're doing the copy command, and I+1, we're basically seeing if that's an index between 0 and basically the maximum index in the tokens list. If that's true, that means that's some value that we can use. In this case, it means that's something that we can actually copy to the user's clipboard. So then I use paperclip.copy to copy whatever is at the next line and copy that to the user's clipboard. And there's an error right here if you can spot it already. It should be tokens I+1, but I also add a new line character after the text that I'm copying to the clipboard just for good measure. And I'll catch that error where it should be tokens with the index of I+1. I then increment I by 2 because we used the command copy and we used a value on the next line, which is what we're copying. I then have an else clause, which basically says if there isn't a value that we can copy after the copy command, we're going to raise an error because we expected something that we could copy to the user's clipboard. And here I specify what line the error occurred on roughly, and I just use the variable I and add 1, which will give me basically the line number where this error occurred on. I then have another if statement, which is checking what command it is. In this case, we're seeing if it's the pasta command, which will paste whatever is on the clipboard. Print it out to the screen and basically just end the interpreter. Excuse me. And we'll end the interpreter. We'll stop interpreting the program by just exiting out of the while loop by using a break command. So here we print out to the screen whatever we get by pasting whatever's in the clipboard into the print function. And this break command exits out of the while loop, which will stop executing commands. And then I just jump up to see what the commands are once again. Honestly, I should have been able to remember it off the top of my head. There's only 4 of them. In this case, I'm doing the duplicate command, which will basically multiply, since whatever will be copied to the clipboard is a string, we can just multiply that by how many times we want to duplicate it, and that'll give us the same effect. And then the result of multiplying it by the next number on the next line after the duplicate command will be duplicating it. Again, here we check to see if there's a value that we can actually use in the line underneath the duplicate command. And then next all we do is we check to see if that string is a full-on number by doing the string.isDigit. So that will only be true if the whole string is composed of digits. Then we make a variable called duplication, which is basically we convert the integer, the number on the next line, and we okay, I'm sorry. Duplication is the number of times that we will duplicate the string, the copied text. We then make a new variable called new clipboard, which is going to be whatever is currently copied to the clipboard multiplied by the number of times we want to duplicate it, which will give us the same effect. So it will basically repeat whatever's copied to the clipboard the given number of times. Then all I'm doing is paperclip.copy. So I'm just copying the results to the clipboard now. Alright. I increment I by 2 because we use 2 values in the tokens list. We use the duplicate command and then the number of times we want to duplicate the value on the clipboard. We just add an else statement. And this is just in case any sort of error occurred. We'll just say that we expected an integer on the next line. And yes, I see that I misspelled integer. I fixed that later. And then I, again, specify what line this error occurred on, roughly. Or at least what the line number should have been, at least. And here I add the little bit that will interpret the last command, which by far is the most complicated, which is the copy file command. which will copy the contents of a file. If the next line is a file name that's been specified, otherwise it just copies the contents of the program itself. It then checks to see if I plus 1 is a value that we can use. Basically, is there a file? Oh no, I'm sorry. It sees if there isn't another line after the copy file command. Basically, it checks to see if no file name was given. If there wasn't a file name given on the next line, or anything at all, it just raises an error. It then has an elif command. Then there's an elif command where it checks to see if the text on the next line is a file. If the file actually exists, then we'll copy the contents of the file and copy it to the clipboard. Here it just basically gets the name of the file that's on the next line, gets rid of all the white space around the name of the file name. It then reads all of the information from that file and saves that into the contents variable. And then we just copy all the contents to that to the clipboard. And we increment I by 2 because again we used a command token and an actual value token, which was in this case a file name. And here we can just have an else command. This is if the file name on the next line wasn't a file name. All we do is, if you remember, we have that variable called raw program, which is just the program itself, and we'll just copy that to the clipboard. And then we increment I by 2 because we use the token for the copy file command as well as the text on the next line, which in this case wasn't a file name. And then we have a final else command for checking commands. Basically, if it's nothing that we recognize, we're just going to skip over it and go on to the next token. So we just increment I by 1. Alright, so that's kind of the interpreter done. So I'm basically just going to scan over real quick at all of it. And then I jump back to the end of the file, and then my computer crashed. So we checked to see if this program is being, we checked to make sure that this program, is being ran and not imported. At which point, we basically checked to see if a value was given, like a file name was given to this program. We do that by, so if you remember earlier, we did a line that said from sys import arg. That's command line arguments, and that's basically a list of each value given in the command line. So basically, if there was not a program given for us to use, then using the index of 1 would give us an error. So in which case, we will catch an index error and we'll say that no file was specified. Otherwise, if a program was specified, we basically just check to see if that program exists. At this point, I realized I could just use the isFile function, so I don't have to have another try except else block, and instead just have an if statement, which looks like this. So I make sure to see if the given file name is an actual file name that, exists on the computer. Then we'll do, whatever we need to do. But otherwise, if the file does not exist, we basically just print out to the screen that we could not locate the file. Basically says we couldn't find that file in the directory. What we do then is we basically load all of the contents of our program and feed that string into our CopyPasta interpreter, which will basically interpret the program. But of course, I mentioned that there are a few problems with my interpreter that I didn't address or figure out at this point, so when I try it out, I'll get a couple of errors. So this was me making a text file, which would basically be a little test for the language. So I'd use the command specified to write a little example. And since any command, anything that's not a command is ignored, this basically works as a comment right here. So what we're doing is we're saying we're just going to copy the string hello world to the clipboard, and then we're just going to print hello world to the screen. So this is just a hello world program. It just prints hello world to the screen. And then here I get an error because, again, it should have been program.split. So I open that up. So here I say I'm splitting up the program by new lines. So I have a list of each line. And then I get rid of the bit of code that makes everything in uppercase. At which point, as I stated, we just, for every if statement where we check to see what command it is, we make the command in uppercase, and then we get rid of all the white space around it. And I do that for every check. And I'm not done just yet because there's another problem with it. An unknown typo. Instead of it being command, it was command with an extra M. Whenever you're writing these sorts of things, you've got to be careful of your typing because it doesn't take a whole lot to get an error, right? A simple typo can make the world's difference. You can see instead of printing hello world, it printed copy, which meant I copied not the next line to the clipboard, but just the line we were looking at. So basically the command. So I look down to the copy bit, and the error is on, I'm sure you can see it, paperclip.copy, and then I copy tokens with the index of I, when it should have been tokens with the index of I plus 1. So then I fix that, and there you go, it prints out hello world as it should have. So that's working now. And I just tried again for good measure, and then I open up the test program again, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try out duplicating. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically just going to print out hello world 4 times. And then I see I get an error, and this is just a bit of logic, a logical error in like my if statements for the duplicate command. Instead of checking to see if the new line, if the line underneath the duplicate command was a number, I checked to see if the command itself was a number, which obviously would never be true. And then I fix that typo. And you can see it printed out hello world 4 times. Then to try something else out, what I decided to do was print it out 8 times. And I can do that by duplicating it 4 times and then 2 times. Since that is effectively 4 times 2, you can see it says hello world here 8 times. And here I test out the copy file thing, but in this case it'll just print out its own source code, or should. And you see it prints out the source code of the program itself. Now I make a new file called read from text, and this is just basically some bunch of text that we'll read from in our main program, and we'll just print out to the screen. So this is just a bunch of filler text that's not really important at all. Now what we do is I have to edit the main program test.txt, and instead of copying the whole program, we say we're going to read the contents of the file read from.txt. So when we run this, you see it prints out all the text in that file, which means the language is complete. So my interpreter is fully done, and that's the whole thing. So if you'd like any of the interpreters that I write in this series, if I continue this series, you can find it at the link at the top of this, web page, and I'll leave it in the description down below. And in this repository, it'll have it'll have a folder for every single language that I implement. So there's already one for CopyPasta, and you can see all the stuff relating to that. CopyPasta.py is the interpreter. Test.txt is the main program that you can run with it, and the accompanying file, which is just some stuff that it will print out to the screen. Now I'm just trying to think about what language I might want to implement next. And there's really just no shortage of languages that I could pick from. I'm hoping to keep it simple for a while, and use text as well for a long while, until I get totally crazy with it. If you have any suggestions for any languages you would like me to implement, leave the comments down below, and I implore you to check out the EsoLang Wiki. There's a lot of joke languages that have been proposed up there and stuff like that, and you can check them out, and they're a good laugh, as well as things that are just totally ridiculous. Yeah, so if you have any suggestions, please leave them down below. I mean, there's really no shortage of languages I could choose from. I might just pick a really famous one next. But I guess you'll just have to see that in the next video, won't you? If I make another one. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video at least. I know I sure did. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys later.